Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi to a video talking about the Chronicled Wish banner for Inazuma. This is the third instance of Chronicled Wish we're getting, and things are very different this time around. Even the worst character you can end up getting on this banner is honestly usable. Anyway, let's talk about each of these characters individually, both in terms of how good they are if they're a character that you're considering getting because you actively want them, and in terms of how good it is for them to be a character you can lose your 50-50 to. As a reminder, the way the Chronicled Wish works is you decide on a character or a weapon, and once you've chosen that target, it effectively works like a limited banner, but instead of losing to standard characters, when you lose your 50-50, you lose to one of the other characters here. Also, unlike limited banners, guarantees from 50-50s don't carry over, which means if you lose your 50-50 but you don't have enough wishes to go all the way to get another 5-star from the Chronicled Wish, you won't be guaranteed the next time Chronicled Wish comes around. So you shouldn't wish on the banner unless you have enough to go to pity twice. And the other difference with the limited banner is the way that the 4-stars work. Instead of having 3 rate-ups with the standard pool for 4-stars, you don't have any rate-ups, but the pool is much smaller. The pool of available 4-stars, technically it hasn't been officially announced yet, but we can deduce what it's gonna be based off of what it was on the previous 2 Chronicled Wish banners. The Mondstadt Chronicled Wish had all the Mondstadt 4-stars. The Liyue Chronicled Wish had all the Liyue 4-stars. So I think it's reasonable to assume that the Inazuma Chronicled Wish will have all the Inazuma 4-stars. The lineup for Inazuma 4-stars is arguably worse than the lineup for both Mondstadt and Liyue 4-stars. Heizo is a pretty versatile character, but not really worth all that much unless you just don't have Sucrose at all. Kuki is good for Hyper Bloom, but with the recent power creep trend, a lot of people find more value in going for dedicated hyper carries instead of sticking to Hyper Bloom. While Hyper Bloom is still very good, if you don't play it, it doesn't matter how good it is, because you're not playing it. Goro's kind of Toma is a pretty good shielder, but even in the teams where he's pretty good, he's not that much better than your other alternatives. Toma's usable with like Wanderer, with like Kenichi, Mwolani, Risley, but he's not really important to any of them. Sarah can be pretty good for like Raiden, but honestly, the difference between Sarah teams and other teams isn't that big, and that's at C6. Without C6, she's kind of ass. Sayu's not ideal, and then Kirara can actually be fairly good, but only for Aggravate teams, and Aggravate teams haven't gotten pretty much any support since Sumeru, so the aforementioned trend of power creep recently, the Aggravate teams are being left in the dust a little. So all in all, the 4-star quality on this banner is honestly pretty underwhelming. And then when it comes to the weapons that you can get, if you choose Ayaka as the character you want to get, you won't be able to get a 5-star weapon. Like you're guaranteed that your 5-stars are going to be characters, but the 4-stars can still be weapons. And the weapon pool is the standard weapon pool plus the region specific weapons. Wavebreaker's Fin, Aquamaru, and Moon's Moon. All 3 of which are weapons that can see some play, but honestly barely. Wavebreaker's Fin can be good, but because the catch exists, unless it's a high refine, it's worse than your free-to-play option, so it's kind of worthless. Aquamaru can be good on like Beidou, but pretty much only on Beidou because burst-focused Claymore characters are kind of, And then Moon's Moon can be good on burst-focused bow users, but the problem is that it's an attack weapon, so it's not that good on Yelan. So it's good on like Sarah, I guess, because it's a high base attack. And you just use it as a stat stick on characters that do a little bit of burst damage, but it's not that good. So the 4-star weapons are fine, but they're not outstanding. Anyways, let's talk about the 5-star characters. First, Ayaka. Ayaka is about to be a good character. In terms of DPS, Ayaka is honestly not very good right now, which isn't inherently a bad thing because freeze is a very powerful effect. The problem is that Hoyo doesn't want freeze to feel good for some reason. So they never give us actual freezable enemies in Abyss. And when they do, there's gonna be a freezable enemy followed by a non-freezable enemy. And because of that, right now, Ayaka's kind of not very good. But Escoffier is right around the corner. And Escoffier gives a massive boost to every freeze team. For multiple reasons, but in the case of unfreezable enemies, the fact that Escoffier's Shred isn't reliant on there being a specific aura on the enemy means that you don't have to rely on cringe-ass setups that don't accidentally miss the swirl because Farina applied Hydro at the wrong moment. And Escoffier's damage will hit the enemy no matter what, so even if they move, that's not a problem. I was looking at some Ayaka stuff lately, and I realized that if you look at the current best Ayaka teams at C0R0 investment versus the C0R0 Ayaka teams once Escoffier comes out, it seems like the team DPS, at least in single target, is about the same if you do current best Ayaka team versus best Ayaka team with Escoffier without using Ayaka's burst. So if your burst completely whiffs, the teams are getting like almost 50% stronger. Now, even once that happens, so long as there's unfreezable enemies, you lose out on some Blizzard Trigger effect, you can lose out on a little bit of uptime on your Cryo Resonance, and the burst can whiff at least partly. And because of that, against those enemies, I'd still say that Ayaka is worse than the like very strong meta carries that we have right now. You know, Nividet, Bawika, Arlecchino, Orisa. But against freezable enemies, she can actually be competitive. Maybe not with Nividet and Bawika, but I'd say it's reasonable to say she can be situationally competitive with Arlecchino Verisa when you account for the value of freeze and how it can prevent enemies from doing annoying mechanics, prevent them from stalling, all that. The thing about all of this, though, is that as cool as it is, it doesn't matter if you don't get Escoffier. If you don't have Escoffier, if you don't plan on getting Escoffier, Ayaka's not good, man. If you like Ayaka, you started playing after her last banner, she's one of the characters that you were considering on getting, and you have enough to get both her and Escoffier, she actually is pretty good. Do keep in mind, Kirk is coming out soon. We have some sus leaks that seem to indicate that she's gonna be a freeze carry, and she's most likely gonna be outright better than Ayaka, so if you're pulling mainly for meta, getting Ayaka now is probably kind of dumb. Anyways, the conclusion to draw for Ayaka, in my eyes, is that she is a character that isn't all that great to lose a 50-50 to, because unless you're also getting Escoffier, you won't really see much play on your account. But if you are an Ayaka player who likes her, she is going to be strong enough to clear the content you want to clear. The last thing I want to talk about for Ayaka is constellations. For an Inazuma character, her cons are really good, but compared to more recent characters, they're not. Her C2 is pretty good, her C3 is pretty good, her C4 is pretty good, C1, 5, and 6 are kind of ass. But if you're planning on investing a bunch of Primogens into Ayaka, warning number one, keep enough to get Escoffier. Past that, it's a question of, is it better to go for Ayaka cons or Escoffier cons? And honestly, I'm sorry, you're better off going for Escoffier cons. Even Ayaka's Sig isn't really that good because they've given her a really strong free-to-play option with Finale of the Deep, and the increase you get from Mistplitter is smaller than the increase you get from Symphonist of Sense, which is Escoffier's signature. Basically, unless you are already planning on also getting Escoffier's cons and Sig, Ayaka's cons and Sig aren't really worth that much of his consideration. In other words, going for cons on Ayaka is kind of a Leviathan-only thing, because you'll see better results from going on cons on supports for the team rather than cons directly on her. Next up is Ayato. Ayato's kind of an interesting one because he's not that strong. The main appeal that Ayato has as a character is versatility, ease of use, and AoE, but they decided to release a Hydro character that also has those upsides while being significantly stronger than him when they released Neuvillette, which has kind of made Ayato not ideal. Nowadays, the teams that make the best use of Ayato are teams that use him for his off-field burst. You can use him for Mawika as the Hydro enabler. You can use him for Nilo teams as well. Technically, you use his skill in Nilo teams, though. Some people use him in Hyper Bloom. But all in all, he's just pretty yeah. Once Escoffier comes out, his best team will be Escoffier, but honestly, it's hard to call it an Ayato team because he's gonna get out damaged by the rest of the team. On a new-ish account, Ayato can be okay because you can do Ayato, Kuki, DMC, and have a functional 3-unit core, but it won't be ideal. So in terms of losing your 50-50 to him, it's not a particularly happy event. If you actively want him though, I'm sorry to hear that. His constellations are awful all around. That being said though, I'd still say he's a lot better than the average standard 5-star. So even if you do end up losing your 50-50 to him, it's still fine. Yoimiya, I think Yoimiya is definitely one of the characters you're not happy losing a 50-50 to, because Yoimiya is a character who's unfortunately too weak to really be worth playing unless you actively like her and want to play her despite her weaknesses. But if that's you, you're gonna pull for her, you're not gonna be losing your 50-50 to her. But yeah, her being on the banner, her being a character you can lose your 50-50 to is arguably pretty bad. And then her constellations are also pretty awful. If you already have her, losing your 50-50 to her won't really make her any better. Next, Chiori. She's a sort of character that is best described without adjectives. She's a very character. She's certainly a character of all time. That being said, she's incredibly versatile. At worst, she's basically Albedo without the cringe of the skill breaking, and at best, she's a pretty decent source of off-field damage. On a newer account, losing a 50-50 to Chiori is really good, because you can use Chiori plus, like, Kachina as a 2-unit core to complete a team for a carry you like that doesn't have very specific team requirements. Like if you're an Arlecchino player, you can do something like this. If you're a Sino player, you can do something like this if you want. And because of Chiori's ability to just have an okay-ish amount of personal damage that's easy to get out, having her available to an account effectively means that, like, you're a bit less at the mercy of character requirements. It'll be easier for you to make complete teams without needing multiple specific characters, which can be quite helpful, like I said, especially for newer accounts that don't have that many tools yet. So all in all, Chiori's kind of nice to lose your 50-50 to. Compared to the standard characters, she's a lot better. On top of that, if you already have Chiori, because her cons are really good compared to other characters, it's still good to lose your 50-50 to. Her C1 doesn't really do anything in teams that already have the second doll from a dual construct, but in Navia teams, or if you're using her as a flex slot with Shilonen, increases her damage by a solid, it's like 60%, right? A decent amount. The C2 gives her a bunch more damage, C3 talent levels, C4 even more damage, C5 is pretty ass, and then C6 is actually pretty powerful. The fact that outside of C5, all of her cons are at least somewhat useful means that unless you're specifically at C4 Chiori, she's a character you're pretty much always happy to see as a character to lose a 50-50 to. Next up is Yai. Yai is a character who honestly doesn't see much play outside of people who actively go out of their way to play her because they like her. In terms of meta stuff, you mainly see Yai in Quicken teams that are more focused on spread and in Overload teams, but she's often worse than Fischl, even in those teams, even when Fischl is not at her best, which means that the amount of accounts where Yai is actually useful, it's not that high. That being said, if you're a somewhat newer account, you don't have cons on Fischl yet, getting Yai so that you can use Yai in, say, a Chevaleur's team with a Pyro carry can actually be pretty useful. I'd say that she's not too bad to lose your 50-50 to, but she's also not great to lose your 50-50 to. On top of that, her constellations are honestly pretty bad. Her constellation 1 is a constellation that, like, theoretically could be valuable. C1 does is it significantly reduces her ER requirements. But because her burst cooldown is 22 seconds, you have two choices. Choice number 1, do a rotation 22 seconds or longer and use your burst every rotation. Choice number 2, do a rotation less than 22 seconds and use your burst every other rotation. I guess choice number 3, don't use your burst at all, which is the right choice, but let's get back to that. If you go for the first one, and you go for a rotation longer than 22 seconds, what sort of characters actually warrant doing rotations longer than 22 seconds? Pretty much only teams that focus on Fischl, which will have 25-second rotations, because that's the cooldown for Fischl's skill. But the thing is, Fischl generates a ton of energy, so in those teams, you don't need the C1 to burst every rotation. Let's look at another situation. Let's look at teams where you burst every other rotation. When you burst every other rotation, you've got 2 rotations worth of particles to generate, so you also don't need this to burst every rotation, or every other rotation. So like, the C1's kind of ass, man. It's just not doing anything for you. The only teams where you really consider using the burst every rotation are teams that generate enough energy that she doesn't need the C1 to be able to do it. I think it's also important to realize that Yai is a character that has a variable burst duration, in the sense that her burst isn't just the burst animation time, it also kills your it relies on you having totems, so you need to have totems before, and it kills the totems, so you need to put the totems back after. That means that generally the optimal way to play Yai is, if you are using your burst, put your totems down, swap out, do other things for a while, and as your totems are about to expire, back to Yai, use her burst, put the totems back. But if that's what you're doing, that means that you need to use skill 6 times in your rotation, plus the burst animation. It's a lot of field time. A lot of the teams that use Yai end up doing shorter rotations where they just don't use Yai's burst at all. Anyways, all this to say, her C1 is pretty bad. Her C2 is okay, but I think a good way to think about it is her C2 effectively makes the damage go from 170.6 to 213.3, which is technically a little bit better than 3 talent levels, but it's the equivalent of 4 talent levels, basically. It's ever so slightly better than C3, but not even that much. Then C4, 20% electro damage, kinda C5, well, we already talked about how bad the burst is, and all the constellations before help skill, but not burst, so C5 is pretty bad. And then C6 is nice for her skill, but honestly, Yai teams in general don't tend to have the damage all focused on Yai. It tends to be very split across all your characters. So going for a lot of constellations on a character like Yai just doesn't tend to be that good. All in all, Yai is a character who isn't that bad to lose your 50-50 to once, but has pretty dogshit constellations. And honestly, it's very possible you don't end up using her at all. Next up, Itto. Itto is honestly really tragic. All the support Gio's gotten has been for the teams that don't scale on defense pretty much since Itto came out. Because Shilonen, which is a character that can buff Gio, forces you not to play Itto with his dedicated support. Because you can't play Itto, Goro, and Shilonen because then Shilonen doesn't red or heal anymore. Even when he came out, Itto was pretty whatever, and with carry power creep, nowadays he's really underwhelming. On top of that, Itto's constellations are pretty bad. His C1 often doesn't do anything. His C2 helps a little, I guess. It's a bit of energy. It's fine. C3 is Pog because Moo. It's not all that great. I don't even know what to say about C4, man. Like, what do you mean, man? C5 is pretty whatever. The C6 itself is fine, but honestly, his only 2 real constellations are C2 and C6. And for a C6, it's pretty whatever. If you're someone who really, really likes Itto, much like Ayaka, scales better with obtaining constellations on the supports for him rather than on himself directly. And if you're not someone who really, really likes Itto, he's honestly one of the worst ones to lose your 50-50 to. Next is Kokomi. Honestly, Kokomi has gotten a lot worse with time. The main teams where you use Kokomi are Bloom teams with Nilo, Freeze teams, Taser teams, and Monohydro teams. But pretty much all of those teams have had changes with time that has made Kokomi worse. I guess except Taser, but Taser was never all that great to begin with, just in terms of damage. Freeze teams, the main purpose of using Kokomi over a character like Farina is that you don't need a healer on the rest of the team. But one, Shilonen's release gave us a healer that actually functioned in the team, and 2, Escoffier's release is gonna significantly overshadow Shilonen, let alone Kokomi. So Kokomi is kind of cooked in those freeze teams now. Nilo teams, Kokomi's still fine in them, but honestly, a base HP increase is getting worse and worse, and single target focus is still very much there, which means that teams that have weaker single target output, like Nilo teams, are struggling more and more to reach the DPS check. If you play them very well, and you've got good investment on your characters, they are still able, even without constellations. But honestly, they might not be for long, even if you play well. And then finally, Mono Hydro, which also got access to Shilonen. And, well, Escoffier is also really good instead of your Shredder in a quote-unquote Mono Hydro team. And she already fulfills the healing role, so Kokomi's kind of... And because of that, Kokomi's a lot less appealing than she used to be. She can be useful. Like, having Kokomi available can be nice for your account if you're a newer player. And she's better than the standard characters, but she's still not all that valuable. And then her cons suck. And finally, we have Kazuha, who is, I think, without a doubt, the best character on the Chronicled Wish. I think most people who go for the Chronicled Wish are going to do so because they started playing after the last Kazuha banner and they want to get Kazuha. Kazuha's an overall pretty good character, but with how many niche supports we're starting to see, and with a lot of them having either explicit or implicit requirements that nerf Kazuha synergy, there's less and less teams that actually want him. So explicit requirements like Escoffier, obviously, like Chevreuse, or implicit requirements like Citlali, who wants to TTDS the carry and kind of won't be able to get a Pyro Swirl after her setup, meaning you have to get your VV buff before you swap to her, and her fairly long animations means that by the time you swap to your carry, you have a lot less VV uptime than you would if you were able to swap directly from Kazuha to your carry. But yeah, nowadays, Kazuha is used in Neuvillette teams, he's used often in Arlecchino teams, he's currently used in Ayaka teams, but that won't be the case once Escoffier comes out. People use him in Mualani, but honestly, Mualani is one of the teams where Sucrose is noticeably better than Kazuha, so people that are more focused on performance use Sucrose instead. I guess you use him in like Chlorine Aggravate teams, but honestly, Godin's also good, arguably better. The carries they've released lately tend to be a lot less reliant on Kazuha, and they also keep releasing support alternatives that can replace Kazuha, whether they're almost as good, about as good, or a bit better. Which makes it so that Kazuha, while still a strong character, is a lot less useful to accounts than he used to be. All that being said though, Kazuha is still a fairly strong unit and he's pretty versatile, so getting him can still be pretty pog. And losing your 50-50 to Kazuha if you don't have him already is significantly better than any of the standard characters, for sure. That being said, Kazuha has really dogshit constellations. When you compare him to other generic supports, compare him to Shilonen, for example, the biggest problem is that his constellations are not versatile. His C1 is only useful in teams that use his burst, which is already gonna make it so that a lot of the teams don't care. Same for his C2. But on top of that, his C1 only does anything if you do the skill after the burst, which a lot of even the teams that use the burst, some of them don't want to spend more time on Kazuha after his burst. His C2 is only useful in teams that use his burst and actually benefit from EM. Technically, he does buff a little bit more damage percent with it, but it's not that much. It's a very small difference. Talent levels don't do very much for a character that builds full EM and doesn't have EM scaling in their talents. Energy generation on Kazuha only helps when he's using his burst, which, like I already said, is honestly not that many of the Kazuha teams. The point I'm trying to make is just that his constellations are honestly very, very bad compared to the more recent generic support characters. His C2 can be good in some Melt and Vape teams. The main thing to keep in mind with his C2 is that the only teams that can fully take advantage of it without any problems are reverse Melt teams with specific setups. Because in order to get your VV, you need to swirl your carry's element, but in order for his burst not to ruin your reactions, you need it to infuse your support's element, which is something that is incredibly difficult to do without relying on Bennett. Bennett's self-pyro means that his burst will always absorb pyro, which means that forward vape and reverse melt carries will be able to get your swirls like that, but forward vape carries don't use Bennett buff. In other words, using Kazuha's burst as part of your setup, if you're not using Bennett, always means that you take longer to do your setup and you have less VV uptime on your carry, which is why most teams don't use his burst as part of their setup unless they're melt teams, like Ganyu, for example. The exception to that is the Child channeling teams, where Child has so much Hydro that the Pyro-infused burst doesn't really hurt you too much. Outside of that, he has an actual pretty decent C6. Like, he's actually a pretty good carry at C6, but he's not competitive with the other C6 carries. He's just better than the C0 carries. All in all, I'd say that this banner is pretty good if there's one of these characters that you want. Say you are someone who really likes Yoimiya, you have been waiting for a rerun for a while. Going for her on this banner is arguably better than going for her on a limited banner, unless it has really good 4-stars. But if you already have Kazuha and you're not planning on getting Escoffier, it's barely better than the standard banner. Next, let's talk about the weapons from the Chronicled Wish. Ever since they changed the weapon banner to be 1 fate point instead of 2, Chronicled Wish has lost its upside over the weapon banner. There's still the upside that you won't get standard weapons and you'll get one of the raid ups instead. But honestly, that's barely an upside, because on a weapon banner, if the second weapon is something that's useful for you, you have a 75% chance to have a useful thing. Whereas on this banner, if you're going for, say, Mistplitter for Ayaka, a lot of the weapons probably won't do anything for you. And yeah, the pity is also slightly higher. And there's no rate up 4-star weapon, so you miss out on potential refines on Fab if it's a good weapon banner. Basically, if you're specifically looking for the sig of a character, don't let the fact that it's a Chronicled Wish banner instead of a normal weapon banner be the thing that makes you decide you don't go for it. But keep in mind, 1, signature weapons used to be a lot weaker than they are now, so a lot of these weapons are barely better than the 5-star stat sticks. And 2, don't spend money on this shit game. But yeah, we can quickly talk about each of them. Uraku Misugiri is a pretty decent overall stat stick. It's low base attack, high crit damage, that has normal attack damage and skill damage. As long as you're playing a character that does normal or skill damage, it's at least going to be a fine 5-star stat stick, but it's not even that great. And then on top of that, and more importantly, Chiori is not a character that actually does that large of a portion of the team DPS unless you're getting her cons and using her as a carry, which means that getting a signature on her isn't that big of a deal. Signature weapons on supports tend to only be good when they're support weapons, not damage weapons. And Uraku Misugiri is not a support weapon. It doesn't buff your team's stats, it only buffs your Chiori's stats. Next, Mistplitter. It's pretty good for Ayaka, but unironically, it's worse than Escoffier Sig for Ayaka's team DPS. And it's not even that much better than Finale of the Deep. Like, it is better, but it's not as big of a gap as the new weapons at all. Haran, I mean, the biggest problem that this one has is that it's a crit rate weapon, so you end up overcapping on a lot of the characters that could use it. Like Lorraine, for example, often ends up overcapping on crit rate if you give her this. Next is arguably the only weapon on this banner that can be worth considering as a weapon to pull for from meta, but it's not even a good one. Because more and more Kazuha teams don't use his burst, it makes Fab less important on him. But the Fab particles are still good for the rest of the team, so the upgrade you get from Freedom Storm doesn't even tend to be that big because you have to build more ER on the rest of your team. So it's an okay weapon. It's also a fine weapon option for Bennett in some teams and for Shilonen, but it's pretty much always worse than the carry's sig for your team's damage. And then next you've got Redhorn, which is hard carried by the fact that 5-star claymores are dog shit, except for Mawika's sig. And Mawika's sig is a very high base attack weapon, which means that with a lot of flat attack buffs, a low base attack, high substat weapon can perform better. Technically, Redhorn is one of the best options for gumming. Outside of that, though, there's no reason to pull for Redhorn over your carry's sig. It's obviously pretty decent on Itto, but is it better than getting Chiori cons? Is it better than getting Farina cons? No. That's a good one, buddy. Next is Kaguras Verity. I'm gonna be so for real with you right now. In a lot of the teas where you use Yai, Kaguras Verity is not even her best weapon. 0.5% better to use Kaguras versus Wandering R1, Wandering Even Star R1. How many refines do you need on a Wandering Even Star for it to be better than Kaguras? Okay, Wandering Even Star R2 is better than Kaguras. Anyways, in many teas for Yai, Kaguras isn't even better than some of the 4-stars. And even when it is better, it's barely better, honestly. So it's a pretty bad weapon to get, honestly. Next is Moonglow. The donut is not it. It's not a very good weapon. Like, it's okay on Kokomi, but Kokomi's personal damage, even with the donut, is a f***ing joke. The only reason to go for the donut is if you think it looks pretty. Outside of that, I don't think there's ever a reason to go for it. And finally, Thundering Pulse, which is okay. It's a fine stat stick, but honestly, there's not that much to say about it on it. So all in all, I'd say this is obviously a lot better than the Monside and the Liga Chronicled Wish, but it's still a Chronicled Wish. If the main thing you're focused on is getting strong meta teams, Chronicled Wish is almost never going to be worth going for. In this specific case, you can consider Kazuha depending on what teams you already have. But like I've already talked about, his versatility, while still there, is less and less valuable with time as new and stronger supports get released. But yeah, I'll be doing an Ask the Jeff Inazuma where I answer chat's questions on all of the characters on the Chronicled Wish that I'll be posting right around the time where the Chronicled Wish banner starts. So if you have any questions for that, make sure you subscribe and keep an eye out for community posts. And yeah, that's gonna be it for the Chronicled Wish banner. It's not a banner review, but it's, I guess, a banner yap. I hope you enjoyed, hope you learned a thing or two, and I will be seeing you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.